Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we are going to be talking about my 5 top hot weather bass locations. It's July, the dog days of summer are here, and we are going to have some hot weather. Now, when we get that hot weather, it can actually help you because these fish get pushed into certain areas, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. I'm also going to give you my top 5 lures to use in hot weather for bass as well at the end, so stick around for that. Let's get started with location number 1. Alright guys, location number 1, lily pad beds and matted vegetation on the surface. This provides overhead cover for these fish and provides shade underneath. That really cools the water down. It can be up to 10 degrees cooler underneath that shaded mat of vegetation, and those bass push up in there in hot weather, and so does the bait. So there's a lot of food in there as well. You want to find overhead lily pads and scum mats and stuff like that that have open areas underneath them. If it's all just solid vegetation, it really doesn't hold fish. So you want to find those mats of weeds that have pockets of open water underneath them. And the closer to deep water, typically the better. You can catch fish way back in shallow bays, but typically if you've got a channel running through, or somewhere where there's a drop off into deeper water, that's going to hold your bigger fish. Alright guys, location number 2, this is also an overhead type of cover, and that is docks. Docks can be absolute magnets for bass when the weather gets hot. They provide shade, there's always bluegills around those docks, and it provides nice hard cover for those fish to relate to. So pitching baits and skipping baits up underneath docks in the hot weather is one of my top producing methods for catching bass in the summertime heat, hands down. And if I had to pick just one technique, that's probably going to be it, because it just absolutely works. Now the docks you want to find are similar to the lily pad beds that we're talking about. You want to find docks that are close to deep water, have lots of pilings, and the most overhead shade that you can find. Now you can also skip baits underneath pontoons and boats that are hooked to the docks, and I've caught a lot of bass under boats as well. So I've also caught bass way up underneath super shallow docks too, as long as they provide some overhead cover and are clear of weeds underneath. So I've caught them as shallow as 12 inches of water underneath some docks, and they definitely will get up under there in the summertime heat. Alright, location number 3, offshore structure. So cribs, brush piles, really deep isolated weed patches. That water out there in that 18 to 25 foot of water is going to be a lot cooler than the water near shore. So when you get that hot weather, it pushes those bass and squeezes them out into some of those deeper areas, and you can really find a lot of fish stacked on some of those hard cover areas offshore. That's a great way to put a bunch of bass in the boat in the summertime heat. Alright guys, location number 4 is deep weed beds. So find the deepest weeds in the lake that you can find. And oftentimes this is going to be an isolated patch of weeds. Sometimes it's a deeper weed bed that you can fish over the top of. Sometimes it's just a deeper stand of weeds that are really tall and they provide shade. But any way you look at it, find the deepest weeds in the lake when it gets hot, and that's going to have the coolest water. Now pay attention also to how the weeds are growing and how the sun is shining, because if you get on the back side of a weed bed where the sun's shining down this way and there's a shadow, the fish are typically going to be in that shadow along the edge of that deep weeds, and that's a great place to find fish and a good tip for when you're looking for these deeper weed beds. So pay attention to that sun angle, because that can really affect where the fish hold on these deeper weeds as well. Alright guys, spot number 5 is going to be current areas. So current areas are a huge draw for fish anyway, but when you get that really hot weather, especially when it's calm out, the current actually helps mix the cooler water with the warmer water, so that current area is going to be the coolest place for those fish to be if they want to be shallow. It concentrates bait. If you can find any kind of hard cover like trees in the water or weeds along the edge, that's going to be a huge bonus. And one of my top places to find bass when it gets really hot is actually where a river comes into a lake, so an inlet of a river. Now rivers typically are somewhat spring fed. At least they have shade, so there's trees growing over them, so they're not getting baked by the hot sun, and they almost always have cooler water coming in, and those bass will run a long ways up that river, especially if it's got some good flow to it and some depth and some cover. Man, you can absolutely find huge concentrations of bass in inlets in the middle of summer when it gets hot. So that's my top 5 locations And we're going to get into my top 5 baits here in a second, but if you're getting value from this video, make sure you like, subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more videos like this one and a lot more coming, and I really appreciate it, guys. So let's get into the top 5 baits that I use in these 5 locations. Well, when it gets hot out, my number 1 bait is probably a topwater frog. It's one of the most fun baits to fish, and it really gets into that nasty overhead cover, like those lily pads, even along docks. And when the fish are in the right mood and the weather's hot, man, it is the best frog bite of the year, hands down. So number 1 is going to be a frog. Throw it on a real heavy rod and throw it with 50 to 80 pound braids, so that when you get a bite, you can really rip those fish out of there and not get tangled up in the weeds. And you'll have an absolute blast fishing in the summertime with that bait. Now, my number 2 summer bait is going to be a Senko. Senkos are absolutely irresistible to bass, and they are the best lure for skipping up under docks, in my opinion. Not only do they skip well, you can flick them across the surface and they just hop right across the surface and get way up under those docks, but they also are a slow falling bait. So that bait just comes down and the tail ends kind of wiggle, and bass just have a long time to see that thing floating down in front of them. If you use a heavier bait, it drops quicker and they don't have as much time to hit it before it hits the bottom. So a weightless Senko, or just like a 1/16 ounce jig, is a great way to catch bass in the summertime. And you can use it around other cover too. I mean, I've let them fall on deep weed lines. I've let them, I've cast them out over even deeper cribs if the fish are finicky, and you can catch fish almost anywhere on a Senko. So that's bait number 2. Okay, bait number 3 is actually kind of 2 baits. So it's either going to be a swim jig or a swim bait. Swim jigs I'm typically going to use in more thicker vegetation areas, so really thick weeds along the edges of lily pad beds, that kind of thing, where I need that bait to really snake through some nasty tangles. A swim bait on a jig head I'm going to use over the top of deeper weed beds. So if I've got weeds coming up 3 or 4 feet off the bottom and a bunch of open water above it, I can swim that swim bait on a heavy jig head right over the tops of those weeds, and fish will rock it out from below and grab it. So those are both great options if you want a swimming bait in the middle of summertime. And man, it is an absolute blast when you get that thunk on a big swim bait. When they hit those things, they do not mess around. So that's bait number 3. All right, bait number 4 is going to be a drop shot rig with some sort of finesse worm. I've caught so many fish on deep structure on this particular setup. So when you got those fish moving offshore onto cribs and trees and brush piles, you can finesse this thing around the edges of that brush. And I love a 6-inch robo worm in Aaron's Magic. That's like my top largemouth bass drop shot bait. Another great one is the Billy Rub 4-inch hot shot. Both of those I've caught tons of fish on in the summertime. And you can also drop shot off the edges of deep weeds. That can be a great way to catch fish in the summer. Those deep weeds hold tons of fish, and they can be really hard to catch sometimes on bigger baits, but you put that finesse worm in front of them and it's game over. So that's number 4, a drop shot rig. All right, and finally number 5 is going to be a punching rig. So this is some sort of bulky, big, heavy plastic with lots of appendages on it. Typically it's got about a 1 ounce tungsten weight on it, and that's designed to get down through that nasty mat of vegetation when those fish are hanging in there under the shade. It's a kind of an alternative method to catch those fish when they're not on the frog bite and they want to be eating something underwater, not on the surface. So if those fish are in the nasty cover, you got to get down to them. It takes a heavy weight and a big bait to kind of get in there and drop in their face. And you got to use a really heavy rod for this. So I recommend an extra heavy and heavy braid. Similar setup for frogging, but also tie straight braid so that when you rip that fish out of there, you can rip through those lily pads and weeds and get those fish out. So there you go, guys. There is my top 5 locations and my top 5 baits for summertime bassing. Get out there, have fun. I'll leave another video for you right here. Thanks for watching. Get hooked up.